Cyril Bouda was born in 1901 in Kladno, in what was then Czechoslovakia and is now the Czech Republic. Both his parents were artists and designers, and naturally enough he inherited a considerable amount of their visual creativity, and unlike many parents they encouraged him in his pursuit of an artistic career. In his later teens, in addition to what he had learned from his mother and father, he enrolled at the School of Arts and Crafts. But even as a student he was already working as an illustrator, and in 1921 he produced pen and ink drawings for a book about the Renaissance artist Botticelli. In 1923 he went on to more study at the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague, during which time he also created a couple of other monochromes for books, before graduating in 1926. But despite these early tentative ventures into illustration, it was as an artist that he began his career in earnest, creating limited edition prints as lithographs and etchings, and he also created occasional woodcuts. And although it was undoubtedly print work which dominated his output, he did also produce a lesser number of similarly expressionistic paintings. He also took on some part-time teaching at the Prague Academy, and in 1930 Bouda married Eva Simonova, and other than a couple of illustrations for unknown publications created around this time, it continued to be printmaking, and to a lesser extent painting, with which he was predominantly occupied. But by the middle of the decade more illustration was creeping increasingly into his output, and among other commissions, in 1936 he designed this rare example of poster work for an exhibition taking place in Prague. He also began designing ex libris bookplates, which traded on his obvious talent for fine expressive line work, usually created as etchings. And in 1937 the book The Life of the Country, written by Jaromír Rasín, was published. Bouda's sparse but enchanting images were rendered with a pleasing limited colour palette, and they functioned as much as page decoration as they did conventional illustration, as they were laid out as composite images made up of distinct imaginatively composed pictorial elements. But unfortunately by this time storm clouds emanating from Germany's Third Reich were gathering over Europe, and having annexed the Sudetenland in 1938, Hitler's forces marched into Prague in 1939, followed not much later by the inevitable outbreak of World War II. Nevertheless, the evidence of Bouda's work produced during the conflict strongly suggests that his new masters considered him no threat, and as he was fortunate enough to not be Jewish, he was largely left alone to carry on working. 1940 saw publication of In the Shade of Linden Trees, a collection of Czech poetry, for which he created some particularly accomplished and attractive full-page illustrations, many of them as composites again, rather than actual scenes. He used a restful subdued palette of watercolour washes, and given wartime restrictions on print and excessive use of paper, the very fact of their publication seems to indicate that despite the German occupation, some semblance of normality persisted, for some at least. In 1941 he illustrated this absorbing complex view of the city Olomouc, although I confess I don't know whether it was a wall chart, poster or magazine illustration. Another illustrated book was also published in 1942, and although the illustrations clearly indicate it was obviously a 20th century work of fiction, I've been completely unable to discover its title or author. But even without that knowledge, the images were another clear reminder of Bouda's talent for creating engrossing narrative illustrations with a harmonious blend of fine line and wash. Similarly, this comical illustration was created in 1943, for what purpose I can't imagine, and he carried on with the production of prints and paintings, although whether he actually sold any during the occupation I couldn't say. But as the war lurched towards its end and the liberation of Czechoslovakia grew more likely, Bouda did create some darker war-related imagery, and in 1945 the Axis forces were finally defeated and the Czechs got their country back. But their independence proved to be only short-lived when in 1948 a Soviet-backed coup led to a communist regime which would remain in place for decades. It was around this time that Bouda began work on a series of engrossing colour scenes of Czech landscapes and architecture for the book From the Czech Paradise. Not being Czech myself, I have no idea what the significance of this volume may have been, although I don't think it would be too outlandish to consider it a panoramic celebration of the more traditional values of his homeland. But whatever the book's significance or symbolic value, this body of work was yet another creative triumph and a worthy addition to Bouda's other accomplishments. He followed these uplifting, brightly coloured images in 1952 with a set of far darker, in both senses of the word, scenic images for another publication titled City of Fire. And although this collection was possessed of its own brand of dark aesthetic beauty of sorts, it was clearly a graphically eloquent lamentation of the negative effects of progress and mechanisation on contemporary life, and the very landscape he had so recently held up for admiration in the previous book. 1953 saw the publication of Bouda's illustrated edition of a Czech translation of Jonathan Swift's 18th century satire Gulliver's Travels, undoubtedly one of the most illustrated books of all time. And given its potential for visual interpretation, this was no surprise, with many others offering their visualisation of this literary classic fantasy. Bouda's version was a clear masterclass in narrative illustration, with a series of colour images, most of them double-page spreads, and quite a few featuring positively cinematic viewpoints. The narrative's emphasis on the folly of man was a gift for Bouda, and with both the colour images and an additional supporting collection of equally engaging and amusing sepia line and wash images, it was an obvious symbiosis of writer and illustrator, despite the centuries and nationalities which separated them. He was remarkably prolific at this time, and only a year later he published his illustrated edition of Antonin Sauva's account of a fictional musician, Pancras Budicius, originally written in 1916. Like Gulliver, the immaculate line and colour washed illustrations for this book were well-researched evocations of period and location. And although yet again I can be no help at all about the nature of this tale, the evidence provided by Bouda's striking narrative images strongly suggests it was an emotionally charged tale of some significance to Czech readers. That it was yet another demonstration of Bouda's seemingly limitless graphic abilities and imagination rather goes without saying. In 1955 he illustrated the fairy tales of Hans Andersen, although I struggle to find that much evidence of decent resolution to show. But for this project he worked entirely in monochrome and created what at least appear to be dry point etchings possessed of considerable expressive prowess. And with this technique he created highly effective dramatic atmospheric lighting effects, and his penchant for surrealism was well to the fore in the scenes he produced. By this point, although still working as an artist, Bouda was conspicuously more prolific as an illustrator, and František Langer's book of Prague Legends was published in 1956, with yet another collection of lightly comical and engaging colour images. The illustrations he created for this commission appear to be a blend of wash and coloured pencil, but that's me guessing again, and I've failed to find definitive information. Whatever he used, they were a more than worthy illumination of the written tales, which contributed considerably to the book's popular success. Alongside these illustrated book projects, he also continued to design ex libris bookplates, created in a wide range of techniques, quite a few of which exploited his facility for gentle mockery. The Canterville Ghost and Other Stories, written by Oscar Wilde in the 1880s, was published in an edition copiously illustrated by Bouda in 1957. The stories contained were generally humorous, even if darkly so, and he was evidently in his element with the production of a large number of gleefully horrific scenarios rendered in textural monochrome, most likely with graphite. The illustrations were arranged imaginatively throughout the book, many of them as full pages to appear opposite the text in double-page spreads, and there were others which set the illustrated images within the narrative in any number of pleasing arrangements. Some of these I've taken out of their context, simply in order to show them at the biggest size I could. One of the more striking examples of Bouda's visualization was his skillful use of shading and illumination, with long cast shadows to heighten the playfully nightmarish scenarios. In particular, Bouda brought out a strong slapstick element from these tales, and although far from what might be considered representational, the figurework used the principles of cartoon and suggested animation to produce lively, entertaining images which stay lodged in the reader's mind. All were relentless in their delight in illuminating the frequently gruesome nature of the tales, and caused me to reflect with disappointment that he never applied this talent to the stories told by the brothers Grimm. I have no idea how commercially successful this perfect amalgamation of text and image was, but in creative terms it was surely one of Bouda's defining successes. And following its publication, it seems he spent the next few years concentrating more on art and part-time teaching at Charles University in Prague. And he didn't return to book illustration until 1965 with The Adventures of Baron Prasil, the Czech name for the character better known as Munchausen, written originally by Rudolf Erich Rasper in 1785. The absurdity of the Baron's totally fabricated and boastful exploits was just like Gulliver's Travels, another excellent match for Bouda's sense of humour and fondness for fantasy. And he created a collection of riotous and surreal colour images which once more were tailored to fit attractively and inventively with the text on both single and double page spreads, which made for a highly entertaining and distinctive visualisation of this popular and frequently illustrated tale. In 1968, Bouda went on to illustrate a collection of Czech folk and fairy tales written by Václav Richy, and for this commission he repeated the visual success of Baron Prasil by once more artfully combining the line and wash vignetted colour illustrations and the relevant passages of text, a device guaranteed to engage and hold the reader's attention. In the following year he returned to the work of Hans Andersen with what seems to translate, according to Google at least, as flute clock, of which I can find no record. The images created for the book appear to be from a range of different tales, but whatever they visualised, they were a particularly appealing collection of grainy monochromes, some of which appear to have been reproduced somewhat pointlessly with colour rather than black ink. Nevertheless, they were uniformly, and similar to the earlier Canterville Ghost, an impressively shaded and illuminated collection. And there was the bonus of this full colour image, which may or may not have been the frontispiece. Around 1970 he created various greeting cards, which incorporated the use of the letters P and F, apparently a shorthand for the French term pour féliciter, a secular version of the usual Christmas greeting, and as such they avoided any of the usual seasonal images. In 1972 he returned to his usual fantasy subject matter with his illustrations for Prague Myths, written by Václav Cibula, a project he evidently enjoyed, and he created a collection of both amusing and more serious line drawings which were overprinted with single colour washes to produce a bridging tone and enhance the work's three-dimensional plausibility. Following the publication of this book, dated evidence of Bouda's work becomes much harder to track down, and it seems that he was finally taking a well-earned semi-retirement, although there were still at least some occasional examples of both his art and illustration produced throughout the decade. But he wasn't quite done yet, and in 1979, and by now in his 80s, Bouda illustrated yet another book, Fairy Tales, written by Karel Jaromír Erben. And the illustrations he produced for this book demonstrated clearly that he had not lost his touch in his old age. As with earlier projects, the pages were designed as composite images, with illuminated moments from the different narratives, using his obviously undiminished graphic prowess, imagination and wit. But this would be his last published book, and Cyril Bouda died in 1984 at the age of 83. Like other Eastern European and a fair number of the more traditional Russian illustrators, Cyril Bouda devoted much of his creative energy to the preservation and reimagining of the traditional stories of the culture he'd grown up in. His work roamed the centuries quite freely, and yet even what were for him contemporary tales were visually captured with a certain inbuilt nostalgia. It seems that in the Czech Republic his memory is still held dear, and I understand his work is on view in various museums around the country. But as with many others I've covered in the series, it seems his reputation hasn't travelled particularly well. I freely admit that in quite a few cases I was unable to date or discover the purpose of some images, but they are no less impressive or enchanting than those so far included. So here's a montage of some more of his work which I hope will indelibly imprint the talents of this particularly impressive illustrator on your memory banks and bring him the greater and wider reputation and appreciation his talents deserve.